Hey, Safer here, and of course race is a social construct. People aren't born trying to compete over who can run the fastest. Eh? Okay, fine. Let's talk about how the idea of race even formed. This important topic is probably getting demonetized as a result. YouTube doesn't like difficult history, so don't forget, I've got a Patreon. Plus, this episode is sponsored by Historic Mail, a weekly primary source letter service. More on them after the intro. Anyways, race is not as simple as epidural coloration or any phenotype for that matter. After all, there's such a thing as albino black people, mixed race people, entire religious and linguistic groups defined as races, light-skinned Asians, dark-skinned indigenous Europeans, and the entirely wonky American idea of Hispanics. In fact, Latino, La Raza, Mestizo, Chicano, and whatever other names for non-indigenous Latin Americans pretty clearly show that race is not based on any kind of biology. Hispanic simply means that they have a Spanish last name, and no matter how dark their skin is, as in how mestizo or mulatto a Hispanic might be, they are counted as white on the census and always have been, despite a long history of racist discrimination against them. These racial borders are easily crossed and don't even precisely map onto skin tone nor anything deeper than that. After all, I do not become a different race by getting a good tan. Race is not biologically derived, and indeed has a history to its social construction. Oh, for the love of Cleo, not right now, Crypto. Please? Oh, you woke fool. Race is real, man. You're just not willing to see the science. There are biological differences in race. They are trying to replace us. You're just helping them. They don't want you to know the truth. The bell curve proves that black people have lower IQs, bruh. Sure, we should be nice and try to ignore, racial differences and that stuff, my dude, but biology is biology, bruh. Of course you're at your worst on this topic. It's somewhat fascinating how old eugenicist nonsense is still popular today with racists like Crypto here. None of that is science at all. It's just you trying to prop up your hatred with a bunch of BS. You're so far behind on the science that scientists came together in 1950 to put your nonsense to rest. They counteracted all of those lies, clearly stating, scientists have reached the general agreement in recognizing that mankind is one, that all men belong to the same species, Homo sapiens. It is further generally agreed among scientists that all men are probably derived from the same common stock. The likenesses among men are far greater than their differences. To most people, a race is any group of people whom they choose to describe as a race. Thus, many national, religious, geographic, linguistic, or cultural groups have, in such loose usage, been called race. It would be better when speaking of human races to drop the term race altogether and speak of ethnic groups. Given similar degrees of cultural opportunity to realize their personalities, the average achievement of members of each ethnic group is about the same. For all practical social purposes, race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. Now, UNESCO has repeatedly affirmed and updated that statement for decades. Race is not based on biology. That is an outright myth that racists spread without any science to back them up. One so easily disproven that it's laughable these talking points are still popular. Race is a social construct, an abstraction created through the collective imagining of a larger group of people. Now, that doesn't mean that race is non-existent. Society itself is a social construct, and society obviously exists. Obviously, the racialization of people implies there is a history to that category. No matter the fact that it's artificial, it still exists, and society must deal with its legacy. We as a society created it, constructed out of whole cloth. Nonetheless, it's still here. That's why we cannot become colorblind, at least in our lifetimes, nor within our children's. And if you truly cannot see color, then you need to have your driver's license revoked immediately. race will remain a pertinent category of social division and restitution. Race is a harmful concept, but it is here and we must accept that its usage has consequences.
And what is a cishet white man doing speaking for the oppressed affected by racialization? You only benefit from white supremacy and can never truly understand the lives of the marginalized. Shut up.
You gotta love the idea of silencing people speaking on racial issues because of their race. Somehow that's racial justice, right? Nah, that's pretty racist to begin with. At least with Crypto, he isn't pretending. You, on the other hand, are still trying to be self-righteous and perpetuating racism anyways. Cheka's sanctimony helps no one. And don't forget, by decree of King Richard I, well, thank you, boy, bigots get banned. Furthermore, we can learn about one another and our experiences, no matter how alien they may seem. That's literally what a historian does. We're required to be open-minded and receptive to others' experiences. Remember, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. You're just segregating history, and who can write it, you bigot? Furthermore, white supremacy doesn't uniformly benefit white people, as we will see. It's awfully telling that woke scolds like Cheka have turned that into an oppression Olympics, but they miss the entire point. If anything, as a white man, I'm the very face necessary to show how racialization works, because it is those with a similar complexion that have constructed this system in the first place. It's not a black and white issue. There can be an unlimited number of races, and in fact, there have been very different categorizations, including many contradictory ones that we currently apply. That's what this episode is about, how Western society racialized. A somewhat comprehensive definition of race is a major division of humanity displaying a distinctive combination of physical traits transmitted through a line of descent. Now, we'll actually find out that it doesn't actually require specific physical traits, but it is always thought to have been handed down as a line of descent. As such, that form of categorization did not appear until the 15th century, and the first writers to use the word race in that specific context was Francois Bernier in 1684. You see, there's a difference between all the different types of ethnocentrism. Tribalism isn't necessarily nationalism, and nativism isn't necessarily racism. It's kind of surprising how many people try to defend these types of bigotry, do so by pretending prejudice has no history. There are very real differences as categorizations have grown more complex. Racialization is a distinct historical process. It has a story to it with consequences. This episode is ultimately about how race became a thing, as in how society constructed the ideology behind this abstract category. This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and Historic Mail. They send out a weekly letter to your address in a stamped envelope. These are recreations of real letters from notable figures throughout history, along with an accompanying explanatory document. This makes for a perfect gift for any history lover, and is simply a nice little reminder of how we all used to communicate. These can be letters from as far back as the American Revolution, or to as recently as the 1970s. It's a great way to humanize the past and read some primary sources, as though these people were mailing you directly. So they send you these regular letters, and I've got a whole bunch of them all set up, ready to open. Let's figure out what they sent me. You can't read. Starts with the context statement, but I like to just dig straight into the primaries. This is how you do a lot of primary research, is just seeing a bunch of letters together and, digging into them and just seeing what the letterhead says and hoping that you understand it well enough to go along. It's to Eleanor Roosevelt from Albert Einstein. So this is when Einstein was pushing for more Jewish immigration from Europe to escape the Nazis. Winston Churchill apparently wasn't very good at drawing, but apparently that is supposed to be a pug, and that's what his wife Clementine called him. Nobody said Winston Churchill was a good artist. You want to see a letter from Walt Disney to Richard Nixon? And it's talking about a potential interview between Nixon and Disney, and like what questions he would be posed by youngsters, saying such as, "When I grow up, Mr. Nixon, why should I be a Republican?" It's marked secret and addressed to, obviously, Robert Oppenheimer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yep, there's his signature. Working on a hazardous matter under unusual circumstances. It's an interesting way of phrasing an atomic bomb. And this is an interesting letter between Mahatma Gandhi and FDR, writing specifically on behalf of this proposal that I write this to enlist your active sympathy. You want to read the letter from Gandhi? You get right away. This is from Theodore Roosevelt to his son, or Ted Ped. Hey, look at this, it's kind of cute. He drew a bunch of pictures to tell a story for his kid while he was away in Washington, D.C. And you can actually tell, because it's actually got civil service letterhead right there. It's to Alexander Graham Bell. It's from Helen Keller. She had to use sign language by touch to communicate, and yet she actually had a fairly regular correspondence. It's kind of a sad letter because she's informing Bell that her father died. Not a nice letter, but it shows the depth of their communication and kind of how interconnected a lot of American society was at the time. So think how cool it would be to get these in the mail on a regular basis, give you a sense of history and through primary sources, but like the actual primary source in the way it was intended, as in a letter. Great holiday gift. Well, if you go to historicmail.com/cynical, you'll get 10% off their holiday sale when you use the code CYNICAL. Thanks to them for sponsoring this critical topic, and on with the show. Race as a concept did not initially arise to describe physical appearance. In fact, that would develop only in the late 17th century. The first law designating race came 2 centuries prior to that, during the final part of Spain's Reconquista. Race took many forms throughout the years and continues to change. It could refer to language or religion, arguing that people native to those constituted a distinctly separate people without overlap, despite readily apparent synchronicity between them. Then ethnicity, as in common cultural background, was argued to be inborn rather than learned. This allowed rich elites to argue that they were a substantially different race than their lower-class subordinates. These non-phenotypical racializations influenced color-delineated race from the 1680s onward. Even today, whiteness is a contested category that defines all else and has always been thus. Toni Morrison argues that whiteness is a blank slate that is default for humanity's imagination, hence why color is used to categorize others and marginalize them. There are many claims to what makes whiteness, but they inevitably define other races. It took half a millennium to develop this racism. Before racialization, there were clear forms of bigotry that placed one's own tribe or society as superior to all else. Later racists would use this to justify their racism as natural, despite the very clear differences between these concepts. Of the early version of difference, Aristotle stands the tallest. He argued, where then there is such a difference as that between soul and body, or between men and animals, as in the case of those whose business is to use their body, and who can do nothing better, the lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master. He essentially believed that slaves were naturally inferior humans, regardless of the evidence that so many of his fellow Greeks were among those slaves. Nonetheless, this naturalization of slavery was the root of racialization that happened 2 millennia later. This wasn't race yet, though. Slavery was merely a labor system. While people justified it through naturalization, this wasn't racialization. That began with Spain's Reconquista. As they took back the Iberian Peninsula, a newly united Spain had to decide what to do with all the Muslim and Jewish peoples still in their officially Christian kingdom. Despite forced conversions, Spanish nobles chose to deny conversos equality. Here lay the first racialization that informs our own today. They claimed that religion was inherent in the blood, and crypto-Jews were trying to hide their religion and therefore needed to be rooted out with an inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
It began in 1478, targeting Jews first and Muslims a century later. They called Judaism impurity of the blood. Yes, race began as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The Spanish Inquisition continued for 3 centuries.
The Inquisition, what a show!
From this early seed of racialization sprang 2 assumptions of how such different categories could arise. Spaniards began by thinking that Christianity was the default race, the one that all others began as and that God had chosen. Everyone else had either fallen from that path or been on a completely separate one. Other races were either degenerative or polygenic, as in a race that degenerates from the core race or having come from a different line than Adam and Eve. For the most part, Spaniards suspected degeneration, hence why they fervently believed one could convert to Christianity and eventually remove the blood impurities they had inherited by being Jews or Muslims. But as race became a more popular form of categorization, polygenesis, as in different races from completely different stocks, would become more prominent. Racialization changed from this 15th century origin, powered by a thing Spain initiated the same year as they completed the Reconquista. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, delivering information of a whole new territory to exploit. On his second voyage to the New World, he set up a colony in Hispaniola. As European colonies grew, they came to use various forms of labor that would inform racialization. Columbus's colony enslaved many indigenous Caribbeans and even sent a few back to Spain. The monarchy forbade further enslavement of New World inhabitants in 1512, but created other systems to coerce labor instead, such as the encomienda and later repartimiento, though Indian slavery continued to play a role for centuries. Neighboring Portugal had been setting up forts along the African coast that became sites for trading slaves. They completed the first voyage across the Atlantic with African slaves in 1526. By 1580, Portuguese slave traders were regularly sailing their shackled cargo across the Atlantic, what would become known as the Middle Passage. That same year, Spain united with Portugal for a few decades, placing both forms of bondage into one system. The Inquisition had also spread across the Atlantic in 1571, so their ideas of blood impurity began to be applied to African slaves and indigenous converts. This racialization brought a new system of legal supremacy to the Americas called casta. It strictly delineated levels of racial mixture throughout the Spanish Empire based on blood corruption away from Christianity. But they also started racializing around language. This language basis of race came because French and English speakers were starting their own New World colonies. As such, both of those languages started importing Spanish racism into their own. Vestiges of both the religious and linguistic forms of racialization remain in English today, but one further form began half a century later, which was based on color. As one historian wrote as far back as 1944, slavery was not born of racism, rather racism was the consequence of slavery. By the mid-17th century, there was still no such category as white, black, red, or whatever color people you want. As Theodore Allen writes, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor, according to the colonial records, would there be for another 60 years. The white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity. The invention of the white race came in response to events in 1676 Virginia. Before then, there had been many mentions of skin color, but not as a form of racialization. But when peasants, indentures, and slaves joined together under the persuasion of Nathaniel Bacon to rebel against the colonial government of Virginia and attack nearby tribes, the local colonial government needed a means to divide and conquer, halting any such solidarity from forming again.
By the way, here is a fun summary of Bacon's rebellion made by Drawn of History, with a familiar voice for Bacon.
Hey, Governor Berkeley, do us a solid and kick the Indians off the good western land. No. What do you mean, no? I mean, no. I live in the Tidewater and not some cement parking lot. This is not a problem that concerns me. And if you don't like it, take it up with the House of Burgesses. Oh yeah, you turds can't vote.
I have a plan. You should wage war against those Indians.
Nathaniel Bacon? Aren't you part of the elite yourself?
Yes, well, I brought booze.
All right, we massacred the Indians. What's next?
I don't know. Burn down Jamestown? Brothers, I vow to you here and now, we will build a new Virginia, where the common man, and myself, will rule, never again oppressed by the... my stomach feels weird.
Did he just poop himself to death? Yes, he did.
Be sure to check out Drawn of History for more hilarious stuff.
Their solution was color racialization. They separated the classes by opposing Indian, white, and black, relying more and more heavily on slavery instead of indentures from then on. And no, Irish indentures were not slaves. That's just false. Prior to this, racial laws oriented around linguistic definition. For instance, there was a 1664 Maryland Act that punished freeborn English women who married enslaved Africans. After Bacon's rebellion, Maryland would be the first to use that category of white in a 1681 law. Color racialization began in the late 17th century, but it took time to catch on. Language racialization remained important. Ben Franklin, for instance, said, "Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" He saw Germans as a different race. Europeans had to invent a biological basis that wasn't just skin deep. The formalization of science yielded a perfect means to naturalize white supremacy. Scientific racism had to be invented and came well after racialization was in full effect. Beginning in 1735, Carl Linnaeus classified biological organisms into a branching structure. He subdivided the human species into 4 color races named by their continent of origin, as in white, red, yellow, and black, somehow placing Arabs and Hans in the same category. He further explained these differences with the ancient idea of 4 temperaments that defined these races, proclaiming white people had the most desirable of these traits. Taxonomy was white supremacist to begin with, but it would become worse. Linnaeus believed in the degenerative form of racial origins, but another taxonomist would cement the polygenic form, allowing racists to scientifically define others as subhuman. This new discipline was anthropology. In the 1760s through 80s, some scientists collected human skulls for measurement.
In 1770, Petrus Camper invented the facial angle. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach used this measure to define races with their skull shapes in 1775, claiming white people had the best angle, of course. Acceptance of his theory grew over time, and he regularly modified it, adding a fifth race and giving them new names in 1795 to tie them to specific regions that he believed to have the best examples of each race. They were Caucasians, Mongoloids, Malaysians, Ethiopians, and Americans. Even though most Germans like Blumenbach had very little experience with such diverse peoples, he had paintings and travelers' descriptions to define what he thought were the best places. For instance, there was this rising popularity of paintings and descriptions of Circassian women, especially of one particular beauty in an Ottoman harem. Most of these were based purely on fantasy or even local Western European women, making the Caucasus this supposed reservoir of white perfection. Hence why Blumenbach used the term Caucasian as the best example of white people. Despite this race science being purely fictional, the term remains popular even today. Anthropology had its physical descriptions, but it didn't have a fundamental philosophy to explain white supremacy. David Hume started the process of philosophizing racism when he wrote in 1754, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to whites. There was never a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent in action or speculation." Immanuel Kant continued this trend despite never leaving his locality. He wrote, "For once a race like the present one has been founded through long sojourn of its original stock, it could not be changed into another race by any further influences of the climate. For only the stem formation can expatiate into a race. But once the latter has taken root and has stifled the other germs, it resists all further remodeling because the character of the race has now become predominant in the generative power." He equated mental capability with fairness of skin and argued against miscegenation, as in the mixing of races, because it would dilute white civilization. What began a century prior as a way to separate laborers by elevating poor whites above their racialized comrades was now a fully fledged philosophy with ethical requirements and metaphysical explanations. Using the principle of facial angle, Franz Joseph Gall started measuring more dimensions of the skull, trying to assign meaning that correlated with Kant's racism. The shape of the skull was somehow supposed to cause different mentalities. So these phrenologists naturalized white supremacy by pretending head bumps proved an imagined category of race and mental acuity, all with biological traits. Race was a justification for slavery and marginalization, even when not mapped by color. For instance, Irish and Latino people were legally white in the United States, but phrenology somehow proved that they were racially inferior and therefore worthy of exclusion from the American body politic. This was anti-Catholicism turned into racism. But almost any type of bigotry could be justified with this kind of scientific mumbo-jumbo. And no, labeling it pseudoscience doesn't remove the fact that this was accepted scientific truth for decades. Every discipline has a dark past, including history, but it's time to grow up and deal with it. Scholarly maturity dictates we understand that objectivity is unattainable. There is no shame in that. At least if we're honest. For shamelessness is a cynical virtue.
Shame on you. Oh, shame on you. Shame on you.
Embrace the suck. Our only truth is verifiability and agreement among peers. Welcome to the real world. It's more cynical than you think.
As such, anthropologists further subdivided the 5 races in order to bring back some of the linguistic and religious racialization during the rise of nationalism in the mid-19th century. According to them, there were 4 Caucasoids: Adriatic for southeastern Europeans, Mediterranean for everything south of the mountains, Alpine was kind of the middle, and finally Nordic for those to the north. Celts, Iberians, Hebrews, Roma, and Samis were all purposefully ignored or excluded from these Caucasian subraces, despite all being Europeans. This is where we get the myth that Irish people weren't white. No, we weren't Caucasian, Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, nor for the most part Protestant. This all came perfectly in time for Darwin's theory of evolution to catch on in the late 19th century. Anthropologists theorized that the different races had evolved separately, and following Kantian race philosophy meant that miscegenation could cause worse outcomes for the progeny, dooming a civilization to collapse if they didn't keep racially pure. A cousin of Darwin's named Francis Galton theorized that there was a way to use this new science and circumvent natural selection, called eugenics. There were 2 theories on how eugenics could be achieved. Positive eugenics encouraged breeding of the most fit parents, but that quickly fell out of vogue in favor of negative eugenics, which sought to limit the procreation of those deemed unfit. In order to achieve these goals, eugenicists quickly set about collecting data on families, beginning the profession of genealogy. Americans eventually took the lead in these efforts, forming the Eugenics Records Office, or the ERO. Negative eugenics advocates for 3 specific policies: segregation, sterilization, and euthanasia. Segregation was already popular as Jim Crow and New Imperialism grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But racial purity gave a clear scientific reason for keeping the races separate and justified white supremacy. Sterilization began as a punishment for select female convicts, making them infertile and therefore unable to procreate. Some states also allowed for sterilization of the mentally ill. In all, the United States sterilized nearly 70,000 women. Many eugenicists honestly believed they were making a more healthy and wholesome society with these atrocities, breeding a master race by weeding out unsuitable people from the gene pool. Some of the most extreme eugenicists advocated euthanizing people deemed inferior and unfit, but that took time to gain favor. Some of these scientific racists were afraid that without the adoption of euthanasia, eugenics would fail. They feared racial suicide, as in breeding out of the Nordic race, a term coined by historian and then president Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. The person who popularized this idea of a great replacement was Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race. Teddy praised the book, saying, "It is a capital book, in purpose, in vision, in grasp of the facts our people most need to realize." This racist fear-mongering led to a new study for eugenicists, dysgenics, as in the study of how the Nordic race might be bred out of existence and how to prevent that from happening. The biggest proponent of that was Stanford University president David Starr Jordan, which is what put the university on the map as a scientific leader, and California, where it's located, became a leader in sterilization. Dysgenics tried to figure out what eugenicists could select for to purify the white race and what to remove. They inevitably landed on the idea of hereditary criminality and parasitism. Basically, if the unfit were given a helping hand with welfare or tolerant punishments for crimes, then they would pass that on to their progeny and create a vicious cycle of criminality and parasitism. Essentially, this advocated for cruelty to those deemed inferior, because they could only hurt the purity of white supremacy. To further subdivide the races, scientists devised a new measure of intelligence. Galton had postulated that genius was hereditary and could be tested. Some French psychologists built a verbal assessment that favored their own culture as the standard for an intelligence quotient, or IQ. Stanford scientists modified it and released their own test in 1916. With that, racists needed a way to prove white supremacy en masse, and a year later the perfect opportunity came. Millions of Americans joined the U.S. Army during World War I. The president of the American Psychological Association, Robert Yerkes, convinced the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, to administer an IQ test on all soldiers, to place the smart ones in smart jobs. But of course, with the alternative motivation of having clear racial IQ scores. We are talking about Wilson. Wilson! This test was ridiculous to begin with. Here are some of the questions they actually asked. Becky Sharp appears in Vanity Fair, Romola, The Christmas Carol, or Henry IV. The Pierce Arrow car is made in Buffalo, Detroit, Toledo, or Flint. Margaret Clark is known as a suffragist, singer, movie actress, or writer. Christy Mathewson is famous as a writer, artist, baseball player, or comedian. The pitcher has an important place in tennis, football, basketball, or handball. The Wyandotte is a kind of horse, fowl, cattle, or granite. The Knight engine is used in the Packard, Stearns, Lausier, or Pierce Arrow. Isaac Pitman was most famous in physics, shorthand, railroading, or electricity. There Is a Reason is an ad for a drink, revolver, flour, or cleaner. Ensilage is a term used in fishing, athletics, farming, or hunting. Okay, do I really need to go on? This clearly measures cultural acuity and class distinction, not intelligence. Yerkes published a 900-page report exploring the racial implications, fortifying the fewer minorities by testing prison inmates, thereby biasing the scores in favor of those classified as Nordic. Even today, the Army IQ tests are the basis of racist claims to superior intelligence, and they were absolutely bunk, for which the American Psychological Association has apologized profusely. Americans quickly used these IQ tests to pass the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and Immigration Act of 24, severely restricting so-called undesirables from entering the country and diluting the gene pool. But there was a clear challenge to this rising scientific racism from within. Because of the myth that indigenous people were doomed to disappear, since they somehow could not adapt to the white man's more powerful world, anthropologists recorded ethnographies of various tribes in an effort to preserve a memory of them before they would supposedly die out. The myth of the vanishing Indian is a pernicious one, but there's a lot of myths that we're talking about that were accepted as scientific fact. Before the Quota Acts attacked Jewish immigration, Franz Boas came to the United States to study American Indians in the Pacific Northwest. He'd immigrated because of rising anti-Semitism in Europe and a growing anthropology profession here in the States. Boas became the father of a new type of anthropology that avoided racialization of its subjects in favor of seeing cultural factors. This was revolutionary at the time and easily refuted all the naturalization of racial differences by showing they were cultural. So of course Boas became enemy number one for folks like Madison Grant. But nonetheless, the new cultural anthropology started to see real success in the 1920s. Eugenicists quickly lost favor, and geneticists took over as a completely separate biological discipline. It would take decades of concerted effort to remove the policy successes of racists, such as imperialism, sterilization, quotas, and Jim Crow, but at least scholars had finally prevailed against the racism they had justified. Scientists realized that the intelligence they had been testing for is mostly learned, not natally inherited. Hence why Henry Goddard,
openly regretted coining the term moron in his work on IQ. From the late 1920s onwards, geneticists proved that skin color was far more complex than racialization allows as a concept, and biologists insisted that race was culturally defined rather than an abstraction of something real. Though the worst version of racialization had yet to rear its ugly head. Fascism rose during the interwar period. It was based on nationalism centering power on a dictator who promised to revitalize that national character, as in any imaginary past of purity. It was perfect for eugenicists to revive their waning popularity, hence why groups like the ERO fervently supported fascist regimes and parties. Italy was the first to fall to this ultra-right-wing ideology, but the apotheosis of fascism and eugenics took power in Germany in 1933. Nazis had long claimed the Weimar Republic was illegitimate because a secret cabal of Jews had stabbed the Prussian Empire in the back to create it. This was obviously an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Nonetheless, the Nazi libel played well with right-wing Germans seeking to recover from the Great Depression. The nation they sought to revive was of a new racialization. Linguists had long theorized that there was some kind of root to many European languages. Philologists found certain etymological links to a few ancient languages such as Greek, Latin, Persian, and Vedic. Today, this common root tongue is called Proto-Indo-European, but Max Mueller coined a different term, using a word that often meant nobility or homeland in various descendant languages, which was Aryan. That's actually where the name for Iran comes from. Aryan, Iran. White supremacists use this theory to speculate about a new racialization. Overlaying Nordics, they suppose that there was some ancient Aryan race that came from the north and were responsible for all the great achievements in history. This was specifically opposed to those who spoke Semitic languages, such as Hebrew and Arabic, who, they argued, were attempting to dilute the Aryan race. The Nazis adopted this racialization scheme. You could see why Passing of the Great Race was Hitler's favorite book. Once he took power in 1933, he quickly started implementing negative eugenics. Nazis created a sterilization program immediately. They passed segregation and anti-miscegenation laws in 1935 and began euthanizing people in 1939. The Holocaust itself could be considered an extension of this eugenics on an industrial scale, resulting in 11 million dead. The Nazis were essentially euthanizing as a final solution. Their defeat in World War II forever discredited eugenics. It also basically ended the subdivision of white races in popular usage, bringing back the idea of Caucasians being one race. Boasian analysis eventually won out. Scholars had been confronting all the bigoted assumptions underlying racialization with the existence of culture for decades. Nazi atrocities simply accelerated that, hence why the United Nations was able to assemble a huge amount of scientists to make that statement in 1950 that I read earlier. Even before the UNESCO Declaration, this was common scientific knowledge. Here's an excellent US Army PSA against fascism from 1947, which, while the Army may have been segregated, it still took the social construction of race as a plain and obvious fact.
What, may I ask, is an Aryan? I don't know myself. But let us see what our present so-called authorities have to say about it. They say he is tall, slender, blue-eyed, and blonde. There is no Aryan race. And more important, there is no master race. There are people who may find these ideas convenient, but science cannot support them. There is no scientific proof that there's any correlation between a man's racial characteristics and his native ability or character. In all racial groups, we find the same range of potentialities. We find idiots and geniuses. We find criminals and philanthropists. We must judge each man as an individual and not by the color of his skin or his eyes or by the length of his nose. Come in, gentlemen. Make yourselves comfortable. There are many differences between individuals. We each have different capabilities, different backgrounds, different views about what's right and what's wrong. Like the difference between me and these gentlemen who have just arrived. But that is not the difference in race. It is a difference in the way we think. Remember that. And remember that there is no master race. That is a scientific truth. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying.
By the way, Emperor Tigerstar and I have been watching propaganda videos over time to get a sense of how it evolved over time as an art form. It's regularly live on my Twitch channel, where I also weekly play historical games. We watched Don't Be a Sucker a while ago.
Let's think about us.
So, that was extremely good, though. As you say, it holds up extremely well. But what does it show in terms of propaganda at this point in history?
The previous one was like, oh, here's why we're fighting this dark, scary thing far away. But this is kind of more domestic focused.
They're not saying that fascism is un-American or anything. They're saying, you know, it can happen to you.
It's kind of a slight shift from the poor, innocent American damsels in distress to like, hey, this is your duty to, you know, be on the lookout for this sort of thing because it comes from within.
It's pretty fun. Eventually I intend to cut these into an episode about the history of propaganda as an art form. A link to my channel is in the description. In biology, racialization is bunk, and has been for many decades. But that doesn't mean this imagined identity can simply disappear. History has consequences. Institutional racism, such as Jim Crow, took the concerted effort of the civil rights movement from the 1890s all the way into the 1960s to remove most of its policies, laws, and strictures governing it. Many lingering consequences of that remain in the system today and were worsened as people used backlash politics to target minorities. I've made an entire episode on that. We cannot simply get rid of racialization. It's lodged in our minds, and halting systemic racism cannot be achieved by ignoring its existence. Worse still, there are those fighting to bring back eugenical notions of white supremacy. People like Ottmar Freyer von Verscher, a eugenicist who mentored people like Joseph Mengele, escaped denazification and continued as a high-ranking academic in what he claimed to be genetics. He managed to pass much of his racial hygiene nonsense back into scientific literature, despite the denunciation of actual geneticists. Worse still was Wycliffe Draper, a rich racist with more hatred than wealth and more money than moral fiber. He founded the Pioneer Fund in 1937 with the express intent to pursue race betterment by promoting the genetic stock of those deemed to be descended predominantly from white persons who settled the original 13 states prior to the adoption of the Constitution. Their first act was to pay for the importation and exhibition of Nazi propaganda. Even though they've tried to rebrand, the Pioneer Fund has been a malign benefactor for the recent resurgence of so-called race realism, but is really just a revival of scientific racism.
Throughout the 20th century, there's been many attempts to beat back the progress of Boasian cultural analysis, and the Pioneer Fund was never too far behind. Emulating Nazi conspiracism, the John Birch Society and its many descendants call liberation a form of cultural Marxism in an attempt to turn back the tide of civil rights, arguing race riots were the nature of minority and equality would usurp the natural order.
Join the John Birch Society, help us fill the ranks. To get this movement started, we need lots of tools and cranks.
When Birchers failed, the Pioneer Fund backed writing a book that pretty much repeated all the old bunk of Army IQ tests dressed up as new science, called The Bell Curve. Despite it receiving overwhelming condemnation from scientists, anthropologists, historians, and psychologists, this new version of eugenical racism is the intellectual foundation of a resurgence of hatred. By playing victim to academic bias, racists can bring back all the old nonsense, because, as Crypto said,
They are trying to replace us. You're just helping them. They don't want you to know the truth.
racialization began with anti-Semitism, and this new round still relies on claiming precisely the same. The current crypto-Jews subverting our purity is academia itself. How else can one deny reality without claiming the people who are charged with understanding it are falsifying it? Racialization is seeing a new wave, this time well outside of academia. This isn't something that arose centuries ago and simply has to be defeated, it's an ongoing process. Racists have nothing new to say, a lot of it is just repeating Kant. But they will repeat the old bigotry until it finds a home in the minds of people too ignorant to learn the history behind such lies.
I've got you now.
Here. And while I've got you up here. And don't forget, by decree of King Richard I, bigots get banned.
Oh my god. I just almost broke my bar.
As you're with light. Hi. What you gonna do? Meow. Thank you. And later repartimiento. Hi. What you doing? What you doing? Well, thank you. Oh, Jacko boy. Hi, Jacko boy. Hi. Italy was the first to fall to this ultra white wing. Yeah, I mean, kinda, yeah. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. So think how cool it would be to get these on a regular basis. Ooh. Sorry, King. I just hit my cat with that.